Welcome to a conversation on whistleblowing, authority, and subversion. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be an urgent conversation at a critical moment when, in anticipation of the upcoming election, we have been treated to an astonishing series of whistleblower revelations. I'm Lori Lefkowitz, director of the Northeastern University Humanities Center. The signature program of our Humanities Center, a home for interdisciplinary faculty research and collaboration, is our residential faculty fellowship program, for which a small group of faculty and 2 advanced graduate students are selected annually to workshop their current research, projects that fit under the umbrella of a larger theme. The 2019-2020 fellowship theme was authority and subversion, and it was a privilege to learn about a fascinating range of topics from extraordinary colleagues. Somehow, as we shared original research under the pressure of events in the world, the phenomenon of whistleblowing at a nexus of authority and subversion kept coming up, and we took some time to explore the topic, discovering that the character of whistleblowers, the consequences of their revelations, and the fate of both these courageous people and the information that they made public were full of surprises. This afternoon's conversation with select experts, moderated by our own expert and 2019-2020 Humanities Center Fellow, Candice Delmas, is the Fellow's culminating symposium, postponed from March when the pandemic stopped us all in our tracks, but is even more timely now. So it is my privilege to welcome all of you on behalf of the Northeastern University Humanities Center, and my special pleasure to welcome back our fellows whose alertness to the complexity and urgency of whistleblowing created the opportunity for this occasion. I also want to extend a special welcome to the 2020-2021 Humanities Center Fellows who are working under the theme of disruption and displacement. Although circumstances necessitate that this will be a virtual passing of the baton, the symposium is the ritual occasion when we transition between fellowship cohorts. I very much look forward to learning from you in the coming year. I want to thank the Humanities Center Fellows for their commitment and important work, and Gabrielle Fiorenza, the center's manager, who facilitates our full program. Professor Delmas will momentarily introduce today's panelists and moderate this conversation. Candice Delmas, an associate professor of philosophy and political science, is also the associate director of the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program here at Northeastern. In 2016-2017, she served as a fellow at NYU Law School. Currently researching the ethics of hunger strike, her 2018 book, A Duty to Resist When Disobedience Should Be Uncivil, published by Oxford University Press, was recently re-released in paperback. Thank you, Candice, and thank you to our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Lori, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me and entrusting me to moderate this panel. Thank you also, Gabby, for all the behind-the-scenes organization. It's a lot of work. Also, I just want to give a shout out to last year's Humanities Center Fellows and welcome the new cohort. You'll see it's a really great, friendly, congenial, and vibrant environment. So I hope you'll enjoy it despite the circumstances. So Bill Shireman wrote a lot about Edward Snowden, who blew the whistle about the US government's massive secret surveillance program. Lida Maxwell wrote a whole book about Chelsea Manning, who exposed the US Commission of War Crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And David Sanger is currently writing about the legacy of the Pentagon Papers. And his writings in general depend on confidential sources and consist of something like journalistic whistleblowing, raising the alarm in particular about threats that we should be aware of and take more seriously, like Cyberwarfare in his last book. So we really couldn't have dreamed of better experts to address our theme for this afternoon: whistleblowing, authority, and subversion. So we count on you to tell us about whistleblowing, the risks whistleblowers take, the conditions for the possibility of good justice redressing whistleblowing, and its role and value today, the ways in which it can hold authority accountable or perhaps subvert authority, power, and norms. So more than anything, our panelists speak truth to power or are inspired by those who do. And so tonight we'll get to think with them about the who, what, when, why, and how of truth-speaking and truth-telling in our day and age. So I really look forward to the conversation. Our first panelist tonight is Lida Maxwell. Lida is Associate Professor of Political Science and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Boston University. She specializes in political theory, feminist theory, queer theory, contemporary democratic theory, environmental political theory, and law and politics. She is the author of many books, including Public Trials, Berg, Zola, Arendt, and the Politics of Lost Causes, that was released by Oxford in 2015, and The Right to Have Rights in 2018. But Lida's most recent book came out in 2019. It is entitled Insurgent Truth: Chelsea Manning and the Politics of Outsider Truth-Telling. She's also at work on a new project in environmental and queer political theory. Her remarks for us tonight are entitled Lessons from Chelsea Manning for Pandemic Truth-Telling. So thank you, Lida, and welcome.
Thank you, Candice, for inviting me to participate in this, and thanks to Lori Lefkowitz and the Humanities Center as well. I'm really happy to be here. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I understand the concept of outsider truth-telling and what Chelsea Manning did. And in my book, I diagnose some problems that I see with the whistleblower model and why outsider truth-telling is also an important way of telling the truth, and then offer some lessons for this moment. So be pretty quick. So in early 2010, as I think all of you probably know, Chelsea Manning leaked a vast trove of documents about the Iraq and Afghan war and American diplomacy abroad to WikiLeaks. At the time, her actions were largely received by the public, the press, and even by some of her leftist defenders as compromised or failed whistleblowing, as the actions of someone who mixed up private motives like revenge, mental instability, what one reporter called delusions of grandeur, with public motives, leaking documents on behalf of the public good. So in my book, I think through how and why we should read Manning's actions differently as what I call outsider truth-telling. And I do this by putting her in the company of other people like Audre Lorde and Virginia Woolf and Bayard Rustin, kind of creating a cohort of collectivity of outsider truth-tellers. And so the whistleblower category, right, it denotes someone who's motivated by a concern with the public good, not private interest, and who reveals facts on behalf of restoring, in a sense, the status quo, what the public interest was and should be. And there's a pretty firm contrast between public and private that animates the whistleblower model. And this was something that was pointed out to me recently in a panel that I did on my book, not my insight, but Erin Pineda, who also writes on this topic, is that this firm distinction, public and private, what I say in the book is it really, people who don't already appear like they're properly public, like queer people, trans people, people of color, Black people especially, right, come to appear as like not proper speakers to begin with. So part of what my book is about how people who appear as not properly public come to be able to tell the truth in a way where they are not seen, they hope, in the dominant terms of like social legibility. But what Erin pointed out in the book panel is that the whistleblower model also renders whistleblowers themselves vulnerable to constant critique, right? Like, did you really do it for the public good, or is it the private interest? And we see this in terms even of someone like Edward Snowden, who took such care, right, to present himself as a whistleblower, as someone who was not doing this for himself, but for the public good. And he, was, why are you running away to Moscow, right? Why are you like, is this about your girlfriend? All of these, like, is it really for the public good? So the whistleblower model has this kind of recursiveness to it that I see as, the whistleblower model has legitimated lots of important acts of truth-telling, but I think it also has problems in terms of who is able to be seen and received as a proper truth teller. So outsider truth tellers, in contrast to the whistleblower, tend to reveal the status quo as shot through with hierarchy, violence, and exclusion. And if whistleblowers aim for accountability primarily, outsider truth tellers are at work changing the world so that new forms of truth-telling, politics, art, and living become possible. So I just want to talk about 3 features of outsider truth-telling and then talk about lessons from Chelsea Manning for now. So the first feature is what I call like the outsider predicament. And outsiders find themselves in a predicament because they see, in Audre Lorde's terms, that the master's tools will never free them from the master's house, but will instead bind marginalized peoples more firmly to systems of oppression. And I think that having that insight for people like Lorde, as well as someone like Virginia Woolf, is kind of what creates you as an outsider. Like, you're still in this society, right? You're still in it, but you start to see yourself as having a possibility to live differently and speak differently when you have that insight. And the predicament that arises from this insight is to how to have your truth and your perspective seen and heard by other outsiders, and perhaps even a public audience, while refusing the public and private terms of visibility and audibility that distort the outsider's person and the truth they tell and threaten their survival. So with Chelsea Manning, I think you see this most visibly in these chat logs between her and this guy, Adrian Lameau, and I can talk about that later if you like. But in those, she says that she would reveal herself, like she would reveal who she is, but she didn't want to be seen in public as a boy, right? So there's this sense, like very clear sense, right? That if I reveal myself as who I am, I will not be seen as who I am, right? I will be distorted. I will be immediately called as she was, right? Like she's just doing this because she's mad, right? About her personal treatment by the US Army, etc. So there's this insight, like I'm in this predicament. How can I tell my truth in a way that could be actually heard as my truth in terms of who I am? And so the second kind of characteristic of the outsider truth teller is a refusal of those terms of public and private. And with Chelsea Manning, I think that happened through her anonymity in part. I mean, I think there was more to it as well, that she refused to be seen, right? And someone like Virginia Woolf has this essay on Anon, right? The signature Anon, which I'm guessing a lot of you know. And Anon is not just like an absence, right? It's not a retreat from the public realm. It's a signature. It's a way of putting out there, right? That you are someone, right? But you don't fit into the existing categories. And so I read Chelsea Manning's anonymity as that, right? It's this kind of, I am someone, I am offering the truth, but I need to offer it in a way where I show you from the outset that I don't fit. I'm not, legible within the existing terms. For someone like Virginia Woolf, this kind of signature happens individually, like you take yourself out of society. For someone like Audre Lorde, it has to be inherently collective because it's through this interdependency with others, through telling your truth to someone else, that you start to be able to even believe yourself, right? To believe that you are kind of capable of telling the truth. And I take up Lorde's insight of outsider truth-telling as kind of this collective, communal, world-building project. The third thing is that I see outsider truth-telling as not primarily about accountability, although it is about that, right? Like when Chelsea Manning released the collateral murder video of the US military, like helicopters shooting people that they thought might be have weapons, but they ended up killing like a Reuters photographer, right? And other civilians, and ultimately shot this van, like rocket into the van that was just picking up bodies from the street, right? She releases this video, and part of it is certainly about accountability, right? Who is responsible? But that failed. No one was really held accountable. But what I see in the act is another kind of impact, which is what I call like world changing. So I'm just looking how long I've been talking. Oh, I didn't keep track. Good for me. Okay. Which is about world changing. And I diagnose this, or I show how this happens with Chelsea Manning, because she releases this video. And there was this soldier, Ethan McCord, who had been there on that day. And he's watching this video in his living room. Okay. It just like comes on the screen. And he sees himself in the video carrying a child, right? Out of the van. And suddenly the world changes. for him, right? And he starts to see, he had always been like opposed to the war, but he started to see that he could speak publicly about it too. And he did. So he's the main interviewee in this documentary, Incident in New Baghdad. He wrote this statement with other soldiers, other anti-war soldiers, veterans. I don't remember the name of it, a statement, I think, of reconciliation and responsibility to the Iraqi people. It's something like that, right? So it starts to, even though Chelsea Manning's action may not have created the accountability that we might think of as important from an act of truth-telling, I see it as starting to change the world. And the fourth characteristic of outsider truth-telling, and I guess there's 4, not 3, is that outsider truth-tellers tend to leak the truth, not in a way where it's in an established, already existing narrative about what we do or how we take it up, but instead puts the truth out there for us to do with what we will. So Chelsea Manning leaked a ton of information, right? A ton of information with no claim exactly about what we were supposed to do with it. And I actually see that as a kind of democratic mode of telling the truth, that the point is for the people to take it up and figure out what they want to do with it. Did that happen? No, not so much with Chelsea Manning, right? But I think that we see there kind of a sense of what could have been. So now I'm just going to end by offering a few lessons from her and from outsider truth-telling in general to think about how we might think about truth-telling in the pandemic. And so first, and these are going to be pretty short, so feel free to ask me about it later, hold firm to the intuitive sense that telling the truth about the pandemic reveals not just like a particular wrong, although it does, right? The way this pandemic has been managed and people have died, but also that the whole system is flawed. Healthcare, capitalism, patriarchy, all of it. Second, don't try to separate public and private. In this moment, we see how the problems of the supposed private realm, how women end up doing the care work in this moment, the precariousness, for example, of trans and gender nonconforming and queer youth. I don't know if any of you have had students who've been kicked out of their homes in this moment. I have, for this reason. Their precarity in this kind of like new home-based system we're in, the vast inequalities of how Black and white, rich and poor households are able to do homeschooling, the fact that some people have homes, right? A much more secure situation than others to manage this particular moment. How these supposedly private problems are publicly generated and can be publicly remedied. So don't shy away from tying together the public and private. Third, be led by the truth-telling of the most marginalized. Fourth, be alert to how truth-telling is calling us not only for epistemological validation, but also for political practices of changing the world, for solidarity, not just agreement. Fifth, don't assume that we know what a truth-teller looks like in advance. Be open to people who may not appear to count as public, offering us truths that we can't hear, but that we need to hear. Sixth, don't get caught up in only seeking accountability. It's important, but changing the world is as or more important. And seventh, remember that telling the truth can be valuable, even if it doesn't achieve the outcome that we thought we should expect from it. And I'll just end there.
Thank you, Lida. That was wonderful, and it'll be a good segue for my first questions to the panelists, actually. So I am very pleased to finally meet and introduce you to Bill Shireman. Bill is a professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. His expertise is in modern political thought, German political thought, democratic theory, legal theory, and international political theory. Bill's most recent book is Civil Disobedience, which appeared in 2018, was published by Polity Press, a very excellent book that I highly recommend, as I do Lida's book and David's book. He is also the author of Between the Norm and the Exception, the Frankfurt School and the Rule of Law, which appeared in 1994 and won many prestigious awards. And he is the author of too many other books for me to count. I stopped at 7. His remarks tonight will be about the explosion of politically motivated whistleblowing in the US context. Can't wait to hear your remarks, Bill.
So Candice, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Can you all hear me? I'm talking to my computer screen, of course. You all know what this is like. And Lita, thank you very much for your comments. As people will notice, Lita and I disagree. We'll have to talk about this, and not on everything, but on a few things. So I thought I would try to address two pretty straightforward questions. I will have some answers. I don't know if the answers are going to work, but here are the questions. The first one, why this ongoing proliferation of politically motivated whistleblowing? So of course, whistleblowing takes lots of different forms. I'm interested right now in government whistleblowing, whistleblowing directed against immoral, unjust, and sometimes illegal government practices, right? And that whistleblowing itself may be illegal. It may not be. It may just take the usual normal whistleblowing legal channels. But why the explosion of this? Most empirical commentators seem to think there has been an explosion. My second, and as you'll notice very quickly, closely related question, why does this explosion of whistleblowing seem to be somewhat American? Or at the very least, why do so many prominent whistleblowers speak with a strong US-American accent? Now, I don't want to be ethnocentric. Whistleblowing is happening all over the planet. It's a global phenomenon. But there is something about this which I think is very interesting in terms of its particular relationship to our political order. So these two questions conveniently have, I think, two answers, or at least two answers I'll have time to talk about today. I'm sure there are many other answers we could talk about. Here's the first answer, and as you'll see, it starts with a pretty strong claim. It's a claim I think I can justify. What we like to call liberal democracy, that system we like to think we're operating under, suffers from massive deficits when it comes to transparency in political decision-making. And yes, by implication, popular accountability. Those two things go together, of course, right? If we cannot make our rulers accountable to the ruled, we can forget about even maintaining some sort of minimal notion of democracy. Democracy is not going to work. I'm not defending, let me be clear about this, some notion of absolute transparency. I don't want to begin, in fact, at all to defend, sketch out some notion of absolute transparency. There are defenders of whistleblowing who do something like that. I think if you listen to Julian Assange, at times he comes pretty close to insisting that transparency itself is the most important of political virtues. There are aspects of our government which should not always be immediately transparent. This has been the standard view. We need to fight about, right, which aspects, but clearly there are some things, for example, high-level negotiations between political leaders. There's a place there for confidentiality and secrecy. Nonetheless, the political system's main players, its crucial decisions, this has been the standard view. They need to be subject to the principle of publicity. Citizens, and of course, they're going to need others as well, journalists, such as David Sanger, you'll be hearing from him in a moment, should in principle be able to figure out who is deciding what, where, right? Now, here's the problem. Usually consequential decisions are now made on a regular basis by political players whom even relatively well-informed citizens probably could not identify. Indeed, most of us could not even identify in many cases which government agency or which government office is making those decisions. Indeed, our elected representatives in some cases are not always able to figure out who is making what policy, where, and why. And just to be clear about this, I'm using the term policy in a relatively broad sense. So I'm thinking of situations, for example, in which we see some congressional statute that's being reinterpreted by an administrative agency, or we're seeing some broad delegation of power to some branch of the government. It's also being reinterpreted in such a way that we really should be talking about a policy change. I mean, a lot of government decision-making nowadays, of course, takes that form. Some of the most controversial things the Trump administration has done has fallen under those rubrics. Now, of course, at times, key officials may simply do whatever they can to avoid owing up to the change in policy if it's inconvenient. They may even sometimes, of course, try to deny that they're pursuing a change in policy in the first place. And I think something like this is probably what provoked Edward Snowden's now famous act of whistleblowing. He seems to have been, all the reports suggest this, he has said this, and I think we should take it seriously. He was outraged to learn that high-level intelligence officials were lying to Congress, and in fact, they were lying to Congress, to keep Congress from grasping the extent to which intelligence agencies and the private contractors working with them, and of course, Snowden was one of these fellows, were spying, in Snowden's view, illegally on the American public. And by the way, if you follow the news, it didn't get the attention it deserves, but a federal court has basically vindicated his critique, just a couple of weeks ago, vindicated his critique of the government's policies. Nonetheless, I think it'd be too simplistic to say that the problem mainly lies with sneaky or mendacious government officials. We have plenty of those, but that's not really the main problem. Here's the main problem. It's the mind-boggling complexity of government in conjunction with our general failure to make sure that this government is sufficiently liberal, and by that I simply mean that it's law-based, and also sufficiently democratic, and by that I simply mean that it's accountable to publics. That's the real problem. The modern state is in fact a leviathan. However, it's a messy, unwieldy leviathan. It's not some neat hierarchical system that looks like your sort of textbook model of a bureaucracy with a clear chain of command. It's a bit of a mess, to be polite about it. Now, yes, of course, recent political history arguably has been about trying to make the Leviathan liberal and democratic, but we have not succeeded in doing so. The most obvious evidence I would have for this claim I just mentioned. Again, there are usually consequential decisions that are being made that impact our lives in amazing ways, and many of those decisions are opaque, and basically those who have made them are not always sufficiently accountable. Now look, if you're a libertarian, if you're an anarchist, there's an easy answer to this quagmire, right? Minimize the Leviathan, get rid of this monster. For the rest of us, things are a bit more complicated. If you think, as I certainly do, that many of the activities of the modern state are essential. Don't privatize my Social Security. Make sure my drinking water is safe. Make sure my kid's school bus is safe. Oh, and by the way, I don't want a terrorist attack happening in front of my house or anywhere for that matter. We're not only stuck with the Leviathan, but we're stuck with trying to figure out how this thing is liberal or law-based and also sufficiently accountable. Now, this is where I think government whistleblowing comes into the picture. And I think whistleblowing is absolutely crucial for understanding how we deal with the Leviathan. It's a necessary adaptation to the realities of the modern state. Without it, it's very difficult to see. In fact, I'd say it's impossible to see how many of us would ever be able to figure out what our government's up to or why it's doing what it's doing. Whatever its problems, and there are problems, and we can talk about this, it represents a real-world political answer to a very real-world problem, namely the necessity for the modern government to engage in these complex activities. And by the way, when government fails to do those things, and this is what we're seeing in the COVID crisis, that can be a matter of life or death. Of course, we need government doing those things, and we need whistleblowers to keep government honest. Now, I think where I disagree a bit with Lita is I think whistleblowing is a much messier, more complex phenomenon. I think the boundaries between public and private are often very messy if you listen and talk to whistleblowers. I think what you're describing as insurgent truth-telling typically can be described as a form of whistleblowing. I don't think we should create a false divide here. I don't want to deny that there are some whistleblowers very different from others, but I don't want to set up whistleblowing as a problem here. I think we have to focus on its advantages. There may be some limitations, but there are some fundamental advantages. All right, so there was a second question. You'll be happy to hear I'll be quicker about this in answering this question. So why do so many of these whistleblowers speak with a US American accent? Well, I just said to you that the modern Leviathan is not sufficiently liberal. It's not sufficiently democratic. This lack of satisfactory liberal and democratic credentials, I think, is a global problem. Democracy is not in very good shape anywhere, in my view. But the problem is especially pronounced in the United States. Now, I know this goes against common wisdom in this country, which at least when I was in high school, and I suspect people are still learning this, we were told that American democracy was God's gift to the planet, right? It's an exemplar of liberal democracy. You will not be surprised to hear I don't share that view. Show me another democracy that has an institution as preposterous as the Electoral College, which of course means that the loser of the popular vote not only gets to be president, but gets to be the most powerful man or woman, right, potentially, on the planet. Show me another system which has something like the US Senate, which now systematically favors rural white voters in states with small populations. So if you're from Wyoming or Idaho, you should be very happy because your vote counts more than the votes of people from California, Texas, and so on. And indeed, that political inequality, and it is political inequality, it's very old-fashioned, it's greater than it was at the time of the founding. So we're actually doing worse in a sense than the slave-holding authors of the American Constitution. The English used to talk about the rotten boroughs, the problem of rotten boroughs. We have lots of rotten boroughs in our political system, and those rotten boroughs typically overrepresent, let me try to be polite, the least diverse and perhaps least dynamic portions of the American citizenry. What about our unchecked lawless executive branch? What about a Supreme Court that guarantees lifetime tenure and allows its members to game their retirements so that they can make sure essentially that their replacement will have political views close to their own? That's how we ended up with the Justice Kavanaugh. Now, other systems have constitutional courts, but they don't allow people to do that. They've figured out how to do this better than we have. So I don't want to belabor my point. I think it's clear. You may not agree with me, but what I'm trying to say, I think is pretty clear. I don't think we're doing a very good job with our liberal democracy. And that is also why I think whistleblowing has exploded within the United States and not elsewhere. Whistleblowing is not just an adaptation to the general complexities of modern government, but also, I would say, to the particular democratic and liberal lacunae of our specifically US version of liberal democracy. Our version still, unfortunately, consists of some anachronistic 18th century institutions that were frankly designed so as to impede democracy. If you don't believe me, go back and look at the Federalist Papers. Whistleblowing is a practical device that we Americans, we're a kind of weird group of people, I think, right? Maybe we're inventive, maybe not. That's a national cliche. I'd like to believe it, but we have invented this thing because perhaps we need whistleblowing more than others elsewhere. It's a one way, an important way in which we've tried to modernize and update our increasingly broken down Model T version of liberal democracy. And I do think some of this whistleblowing, I mean, so yes, in some sense, I'm saying it's a way to make sure liberal democracy lives up to its own ideals. Perhaps that's, and Rita, in your sense, the status quo. But I think many of those acts of whistleblowing, in fact, are quite, they push liberal democracy in ways that it has never been established or has never existed in the US. So in that sense, it's potentially subversive in my view. We can talk about that. I think, again, a distinction between subversion here and status quo is it misses what's going on with a lot of these whistleblowers. Not surprisingly, I'm almost done. Many of our most famous whistleblowers, where have they emerged within the national security state? The least liberal in the sense of least law-based, and yes, least democratic in the sense of least accountable to publics part of our political system. Now, in the best of all political worlds where liberal democracy functioned as it ideally would, according to the textbooks, the Leviathan was strictly in accordance with our deepest normative ideals, perhaps we might not need government whistleblowing. But that's clearly not the world we find ourselves in, nor is it the world we're going to find ourselves in anytime soon. So I just want to conclude very quickly by noting that these preliminary observations are just that. They're very preliminary, obviously, and I hope they haven't been too crude. All I've tried to do is point out that under contemporary political conditions, government whistleblowing is useful, and yes, it's indispensable. And of course, that's the start of the conversation we need to have. There are a lot of questions that are tougher we'll need to talk about. For example, how precisely should we categorize and understand whistleblowing? Right, so Lita and I think, already have some disagreements here, and we need to talk more about that. How does it differ, let's say, from civil disobedience, from conscientious objection, other forms of protest or law breaking? When is it legitimate? When is it illegitimate? How do we decide that? Based on what I have said, you will not be surprised to hear that I think we should situate our discussion of those questions, and those questions very quickly can become abstract and philosophical. We need to place them in the particular political context in which we find ourselves. And that context, as I've been trying to suggest, is one that should worry us, at least if we care, and I'm assuming we all do care, about democracy's prospects. And in my view, those prospects right now are not very good, particularly though not exclusively here in the United States. So let me stop there, Candice, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to vent like this.
Thank you for these wonderful comments, Bill. I really look forward to hearing you all get at each other's throat about this. All right, David Sanger, our third panelist, is a national security correspondent and a senior writer at the New York Times, where he has also served as Tokyo Bureau Chief, Washington Economic Correspondent, White House Correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and Chief Washington Correspondent. David has been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes and has himself won many prizes for his reporting, including, among many others, the Merriman Smith Memorial Award for coverage of national security issues. He is the author of 2 bestsellers on foreign policy and national security, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power, published in 2009, and Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power, published in 2012. His newest book is entitled The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. It examines the rise of cyber conflict among big and small states and the ways in which it is changing the nature of global power. Finally, David also teaches at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, across the river from Northeastern, although in this virtual conference, it's not very
We're
relevant
all across
to
the
say
river
that.
in the virtual conference, right?
David, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Candice, and thanks very much to Lita and to Bill for your comments. I'm going to talk a little bit here about how I perceive the whistleblowing process as a journalist. I'm not an academic, although, as Candice suggests one, I play one each semester, each fall semester at the Kennedy School, where I teach national security with Graham Allison. But I hope that my foot in both these academic and journalistic worlds will enable me to try to give you a slightly different angle onto a key question, which is, what is the difference between a whistleblower and a journalistic source? Because while they have a lot of overlap, they're not exactly the same thing. And that's why I found Lita and Bill's comments and their differences so fascinating here. And a lot of this, as you'll see in my discussion, comes out of my reporting on what is probably the most secretive part of the national security state that Bill referred to, which is, of course, the rise of cyber as the primary way that nations compete with each other, build up new arsenals, and so forth. Vast amounts, billions of dollars that go into that each year, and usually surrounded by a fair bit of secrecy. And I'll come back to that. That was the topic of The Perfect Weapon. And for those of you who don't want to read the book, next month, actually, I think a month from tomorrow, you'll be able to see the HBO documentary by the same title called The Perfect Weapon, which will broadcast 3 weeks before the election, because so much of the cyber world we've come to know is, of course, wrapped up in manipulation of elections as well. Next year, we'll have the 50th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers case, which is critical to our discussion today because in many ways, Daniel Ellsberg was the first whistleblower of modern times, at least in the national security space. For those of you who don't know his story terribly well, he published a secret history of the Vietnam War that had been compiled at the Pentagon. He had been part of the team that did it and written by Rand Corporation. And that history showed that the US government wasn't telling the truth about its progress in the war in Vietnam, in part because it didn't want to admit the truth to itself, and in part because it didn't want to demoralize the troops. Not unlike President Trump's explanation to Bob Woodward that while he understood the truth about coronavirus, he thought it would be demoralizing to go talk about it. And that was sort of the argument that was made 50 years ago at the time of Pentagon Papers. Now, if you read the Pentagon Papers today, and you can because the whole thing got published by the Times when we first published Pentagon Papers, but by others as well as a full book. you would probably look at this and say, excuse me, this was classified? This led a government to go to the Supreme Court to try to stop the New York Times from publishing an account the government itself wrote, a secret history? When you think about the fact that most of what we cover today is right on the moment, what plans are in Afghanistan, what kind of nuclear developments are going on as we understand them in Iran or North Korea or here in the United States, and certainly what's happening in the field of cyber, those are all active and current. The Pentagon Papers was a history. It looked back. But it was also a very critical case because it established that the government has no ability to impose what's called a prior restraint, pre-publication censorship. And that was critical to the rise of whistleblowers, particularly in the national security arena, because once the members of the government, bureaucrats, defense officials, intelligence officials, realized that the government couldn't stop their story from coming out, couldn't force the New York Times not to publish it, it then changed the nature of their own incentives for many of their own different reasons to go make public what they made public. Now, we've talked about so far in the previous two great presentations, very different examples, different from the Ellsberg case. So let's start with Chelsea Manning, which Lita brought up her leakage. We learned from Chelsea Manning and from the revelation of the State Department documents, not that the government was doing something different from what it said. In other words, it wasn't quite like the Pentagon Papers. In fact, you couldn't read them without concluding the government was doing largely what it said it was doing. And that was one of the startling concepts we came to when we published a book called State's Secrets, which compiled some of the most interesting of the WikiLeaks documents as we compiled them, and the articles that brought so much interpretation to them. And what was interesting about the difference between, say, a Daniel Ellsberg and a Chelsea Manning was that Ellsberg intimately knew and understood this history and what it meant and could put it in context for you. And Chelsea Manning didn't. Chelsea Manning knew that she had access to a classified trove of largely State Department, also some Defense Department material, really didn't know what was in it, and sort of threw it out there. So while I would call Ellsberg a truth teller in the way that Lita described, I'm not sure necessarily, I'd be interested if we could take this up in the debate, whether I would put Chelsea Manning in the same category, because the phrase suggests that Manning had an understanding of what was in the documents. And I'm not sure that she did, based on what we knew during the trial and what we've learned in her statement since. We did get some great insights into diplomacy on North Korea. I wrote those from going through the documents. And just to remind people, it's not that the documents just spilled out there. The documents went from Chelsea Manning, of course, to WikiLeaks, were then given to The Guardian in London. The Guardian didn't know how to go interpret or contextualize a lot of the US documents. There were some non-US documents there. They brought them to us over Julian Assange's objections, because he didn't like what we had written about some of his past personal life, which was, to put it generously, complex. And we spent between August and Thanksgiving basically going through these documents, reporting through them, and then ultimately on the Monday before Thanksgiving, going to the US government saying, here are the 150 documents we plan to write from. If you have significant security concerns about what's in them, we want to hear that now. That is not something that Chelsea Manning or Assange had in mind. It is something The Guardian had in mind. Not that we were giving the US government the opportunity to say you can and can't publish this, but instead to raise reasonable objections. And there were a few reasonable objections they raised that went to the identification of innocent dissidents in China who might have been exposed and so forth. We had anticipated most of those and edited a good number of those out. But while we learned a lot from WikiLeaks, I would not say that we learned things that made you view the government in a different way, and in a way that it was significantly violating the law. Now, Edward Snowden was quite different. He did reveal a lot about mass surveillance plans, some of which we knew about, some of which we knew only a little about, and some of which we knew nothing about. And as you heard Lita and Bill say, that actually brought about some real change, right? After the revelation that the intelligence agencies were listening in on Chancellor Merkel, President Obama ordered them to stop. After we learned about the mass collection of data, not the phone conversations, but the metadata around them that was being collected even about domestic calls, the government stopped that as well, moved it to the telecommunications firms, made it a little bit harder for the intelligence community to get at that data, believed that who was talking to whom could still be important in fighting terrorism, but took out of the intelligence world that the actual data itself. So I would say that Snowden had some impact in the area that he was talking about, mass surveillance. But in my view, his greatest impact was in a territory he wasn't even intending to be important. And that was what he revealed about American cyber capability. That as the United States was complaining about Huawei, the giant Chinese telecommunications company, we were involved in something called Project Shot Giant, Operation Shot Giant, to get inside Huawei and understand the workings of their technology so that we could tap into it if they put it in a foreign adversary nation. We understood a lot more about the depth to which the NSA and others engage with both adversaries and collaborate with groups like GCHQ, the British equivalent of NSA. Now, again, back to Lita's suggestion that about truth tellers. Did Snowden know that this was the truth he was telling? It wasn't actually the thing that motivated him to leak the documents. And yet I would argue that the most important journalistic contribution that Snowden made was to an understanding for all of us about American offensive cyber capability that I don't think he particularly found either illegal or that made him particularly unhappy. In fact, if you go back into his own writings, when I had made some of the revelations in The Inheritance about the way we were getting inside the Iranian nuclear program, he wrote to a friend, it's in one of the biographies of him, how much he thought that the New York Times should be hung out to dry for the revelation, which I find kind of interesting from the man who later on just blasted the documents out. So this is why I say that modern journalistic sources are different at times than whistleblowers. We've seen a lot of whistleblowers, as Bill has suggested, who simply take a load of documents and throw them out there and say, you guys figure it out. And frankly, most Americans don't have the time, and most don't have the expertise to sort through what they need. That's why WikiLeaks was going to The Guardian to begin with, because they knew that they would get much more impact if a group of journalists actually took the material, decided what was important, wrote big stories to a big audience, and published them. And that's why none of these disclosures quite fit the mold of the Pentagon Papers case, because that clash of the government changed the way, as I suggested before, American news organizations not only deal with the law and their own constitutional ability to publish, but how they weigh the decisions to publish national security stories. None of the Times's articles in recent times, especially in our cyber coverage, the area into which we devote the most time and the most effort in the national security arena, emerged from the disclosure of a single secret Pentagon history akin to the Pentagon Papers. Nor do they come from a huge digital data dump like the WikiLeaks disclosures or like Snowden's in 2013. Instead, they emerge from reporting that is now an everyday staple of covering national security in an age of terrorism, drone warfare, and daily cyber conflict. They're more akin to battlefield reporting, the digital analog to the on-the-ground comparisons between how Washington assesses military progress and what a battle might look like in Iraq or Afghanistan. Except this time it's playing out in cyberspace, and the operations are often covert or clandestine and run by the NSA or by its military counterpart, United States Cyber Command. And over the past decade, these have become the stories that measure how well the US military and the nation's intelligence agencies are doing at their most important task, which is keeping America safe. And they're the stories that delve, often to the discomfort of the US government, into the critical question of how the United States uses cutting-edge new technologies like cyber weapons at a moment the US itself, the most wired nation on earth, is a target of daily attack. And it's this kind of reporting that enables us to figure out, are these weapons deterring Russia from meddling in the elections in 45 or 50 days, or from threatening American infrastructure? Are they actually keeping adversaries off balance, unable to threaten Americans or not? And how should we employ these weapons ourselves? A subject the US government doesn't like having discussed, but that the Snowden revelations, the revelations that many of us have made journalistically, have contributed. I say this in conclusion because journalists are always interested in whistleblowers, but unlike whistleblowers, they're not interested in the leak for the sake of leaking. If you're responsible about what you're doing with this stuff, you're not just taking the documents and throwing them out there where they might be able to get somebody killed. You're curating them, to use the modern phrase. You're using them to flush out real policy issues. You're going back to assess what they tell you that we didn't know from public sources. And while at moments, like the Ukraine case that led to President Trump's impeachment, whistleblowers are absolutely vital because they were witnesses to history, it wasn't the whistleblowing alone that let us assess what went on. It was the release of transcripts of the conversations between the president and the president of Ukraine. It was all of the downstream material that the whistleblowers shook free. We've seen that in spades in the coronavirus coverage, because it was our task starting in March to assemble to answer the question, is the government being honest with you about what it knows about the dangers? Is it organizing itself properly to confront them? Is the president deliberately downplaying them? You didn't need Bob Woodward to answer that question last week. You saw the answers in some giant pieces that we published and others published back in April as we reconstructed what the president knew and when they knew it. We knew some of that from journalistic sources inside the administration. We knew it from some people who had left the administration. We knew it from health professionals. We knew it from documents we were able to obtain, some through Freedom of the Information Act. I've been a reporter now for 38 years. To my sadness, I've never been invited into a darkened parking lot to have someone drop a load of documents on me and say, this will answer the story, the question. This will give you the story you want. If that happened, my life would be a whole lot easier, but the world doesn't work that way. A whistleblower, by definition, comes to something with an agenda. It might be the best of motives. It might not be. They might be seeking self-aggrandizement. They might be seeking to explain something. They may be motivated by a belief that the government is acting illegally or immorally, and we've seen all of that. And you can do nothing but congratulate those who stepped forward in the Ukraine case, who were pure whistleblowers. Many of them actually went through the whistleblower process and the whistleblower law. But that's not what modern journalism does. It takes the material you get from whistleblowers, but it combines it with much more reporting. Digitally amassed journalism, publicly available material. We now sometimes task satellites to go up over private commercial satellites to go up over North Korean and Iranian nuclear sites. We did it just this summer so that we can compare what the government is saying to evidence that we've amassed. And so I'll end mine the way Bill ended his. Whistleblowing is a complex topic. The motivations of whistleblowers vary. Frequently they're believable, frequently they're not, but in any case, if you're going to be a responsible reporter, you have to take them as one important contributor to the data, but not something that you're just going to sit down and write. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, David. Okay, so the plan now is for me to ask you a couple of questions so as to give the time to give people in the live chat time to type up their question or else write RTS, request to speak, and they'll be able to unmute themselves then when I call on them, okay? So I'm gonna just start by asking something that sounds like conceptual, so about the distinction between whistleblowing and leaks and sources and truth-telling and so on, just to invite all three of you to kind of restate what you take those practices to be about, because we heard leaks used kind of normatively, positively by Lida, less so by David, whistleblowing the double-edged sword too. For Bill, it was a kind of positive concept. So there is a common distinction between whistleblowing and leaks that was particularly forefronted during the Ukraine gate. So Trump, for instance, repeatedly depicted the official who blew the whistle on his phone call with the Ukrainian president and who triggered the impeachment inquiry as a mere leaker, so suggesting that if he had been a whistleblower, it would be a kind of better stance, right? So Michael Walzer has argued that whistleblowing exposes genuine, serious wrongdoing, whereas leaks merely reveal embarrassing information. Snowden, for his part, in his memoir, Permanent Record, understand leaking and whistleblowing in terms of the motivation of the agent. So he says that leaking is disclosure done not out of public interest, but out of self-interest, whereas whistleblowing is the opposite. and he sees leaking, the epitome of leaking in the plant or propaganda seeding, so the selective release of protected information to journalists in order to sway popular opinion or affect the course of the decision making. So I'm not going to say more. I think that with this frame, you can each of you kind of address the particular issue you want to. So I'd love to hear from all three of you in the order you wish.
I'm happy to go first. So I have you know why I'm going first? Because my answer is inadequate. So I think we have to have a very broad conception of whistleblowing, right? So in front of me, I have this old article. I can provide the citation to people, and here it is. Whistleblowing refers to disclosures by organization members, former or current, of illegal, immoral, or illegitimate practices under the control of their employers, and those could be government employers, to persons or organizations that may be able to affect action. And that includes, and this is where I think Lita and I disagree, and maybe David and I are closer, I'm not sure. You know, this could mean doing something subversive. It could mean upholding the status quo. It could mean doing something in the middle that doesn't neatly fit either one of those categories. This sort of action could rest on all sorts of complicated views of public and private and the distinction between them. Now, I do think, so where does leaking come in? Well, I don't think we want to load the dice too much, but I have to say I do like what Snowden says there. I think that is probably, at least to begin with, a useful way to think about it, right? So leaking means that you're not really undertaking this action as a way, you don't see yourself as a member of a political community who's showing respect to your fellow members by, in some sense, speaking about something of common interest or common concern. You know, so whistleblowing on some level probably should do that or something like that. But I wouldn't want that to be too restrictive either.
So I don't have a particular problem with the whistleblower concept being somewhat narrowed. And the law narrows it within the government to give protection to somebody who is revealing something that they believe to be illegal or a contravention of security. You might whistleblow because you believe that your boss is spying for the Russians or the Chinese. In other words, in order to maintain a government status quo, you may not be protesting to the government. You may be whistleblowing because you believe, and this is the most common one in government, that money is being wasted or misallocated, right? And again, you may be a member of the establishment upholding the establishment. If you think about Colonel Vindman and his whistleblowing count, he wasn't whistleblowing because he believed that U.S. policy was wrong or something. He believed that there had been misbehavior by the President of the United States in seeking private political gain. In other words, getting the Ukrainians to go after Joe Biden in the course of conducting normal U.S. diplomacy. And he was basically arguing that the normal boundaries of diplomacy were being violated by the president because the president was hijacking the system for his own personal political purposes. Now, does that mean that Vindman was an ideologue? Not necessarily. I don't know if Vindman was a Democrat or a Republican. I don't know. I don't care. I actually don't think that he was motivated by a partisan political motive, but rather objecting to the fact that the president was acting in ways that he believed were detrimental to his ultimate oath to the Constitution and Vindman's oath. Same thing in many ways for Daniel Ellsberg, who believed that the government was not leveling with the American people about how the Vietnam War was going, and therefore affecting the debate about whether we should remain inside the war, continue with the war. Leakers are a little bit different. I've had a lot of people leak documents because they want to support a government position, right? During the run-up to the Iraq War, we had leaks from members of the Bush administration who were trying to establish that Saddam Hussein was engaged in activities that should provoke the wharf mapping. That was a leak, right? Now, some of them, sometimes leakers are at low levels. But I've had leaks from secretaries of state, national security advisors, and in a couple of cases, presidents. That's not an anti-establishment leak. That's a leak intended to go support their position. And yet they don't want to be associated necessarily with the document. Now, what am I supposed to go do with that? Throw it right onto the New York Times website? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's quite what you guys have in mind for independent journalism. You want us to take that and compare it to all of our other reporting and try it out on other sources who may not have the same agenda. I know that President Trump uses leaks to make it sound like he's a leaker, something he would say about Comey, who, by the way, I never found any evidence leaked anything. But that's because it's taken on a certain pejorative term. I don't think of leaks in a pejorative way at all. Now, given my business, you wouldn't expect me to necessarily. So I think there is, or there can be, a significant difference between leakers and whistleblowers. Go back in history at all of the different things that were leaked by American presidents, including information about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Would you call that whistleblowing? Not exactly.
So my perspective is a little bit different. So I think there's a lot of, as we can see, there's a lot of normative kind of gatekeeping around the category of whistleblower. And I think that comes out of the desire, I think, to protect a group of people who are perceived as very vulnerable for good reason. Like if you read this older Fred Alford book about whistleblowers, like on within organizations as well as within government, most of their lives are pretty awful, right? After they blow the whistle, they have this faith that like telling the truth is going to have these effects. And, most of them lose their jobs, right? They don't end up like seeing what they hope to come to fruition through telling the truth actually happen, right? It's not usually a kind of heroic act that is taken up that way. And so I think that the normative gatekeeping is about trying to protect and show the heroism and courage of these individuals. But I think that the downside of that is that we end up with these pretty rigid categories about who's in and who's out. And like the idea that it's someone who's doing it on behalf of the public interest and not their private interest, I think is extremely loaded. I think that's exactly what leads people. Two things lead people to see Chelsea Manning as not a true whistleblower. One is that, right? And I think that what happens when you have this public-private category is like, well, what's considered public and what's considered private, right? And historically, as we know, right, women were considered not truly public, right? Black people were considered not truly public, right? And now, just because you're a trans person telling the truth, right, you're perceived as bringing something in, right? Your self-interest, yourself, right? By virtue of the fact of who you are. And so I think there's something really important in acknowledging how challenging the very divide between public and private, and what's properly public and what's properly private, and what should be disclosed and what shouldn't, is really an important act of truth telling. And the second reason that Chelsea Manning is often disqualified is because of the reason that David said. She didn't know the documents, she just released this huge trove of information, it wasn't targeted at a particular wrong. And my interest is in saying, that kind of truth telling is valuable too. Her interest was not in seeking accountability for a particular wrong, but precisely in saying, like, look at what we are doing, right? Yes, we're doing what we say we're doing, and isn't it awful, right? Isn't war and patriarchy and heteronormativity all of a piece? And isn't it terrible what we are all mixed up in? Don't we want something different? And so there's an effort not to say, hey, affirm what I'm saying, agree with the truth of it, but an act of truth telling that's about creating a democratic collectivity and changing the world. And so for me, the distinction between whistleblower and leaking, when we worry about that and we try to say, who's in and who's out, and it, I think, leads us away from maybe a more important problem, which is like, what kind of truth telling do we need in a democracy? And it's not just, right, this kind of narrow leaking of facts or whistleblowing about facts, but other forms of truth telling as well. And I can keep going, but I'll stop.
Thank you. So I'll just ask you a last question, kind of a full question with many questions in them for you to pick. And then we'll open to the live chat, and there are already some questions. So between the deadly global pandemic and the wildfires devastating the West, climate change, and a president who lies and governs for his own profit, and is deploying violence against peaceful protesters and so on, let's just say we want some change. And so I just want to ask a question about, like, how do we affect change, and what kind of environment do we want to foster? What kind of climate do we need? Do we need more truth? And if so, in what form? Is it more transparency, more investigative journalism, more leakers, more whistleblowers? Hannah Arendt identifies the media, academia, and courts as the crucial bulwarks against organized lying. What do you think are our safeguards today? What role do you see yourself as playing, and what can we do to do our part? And what would truth-telling and whistleblowing look like in a well-functioning and healthy democracy? Would it even be necessary?
Small question, Candice, small question. All right, I'll go first. I'll just throw something out there. It's totally insufficient to the question. I think Arendt sees the media rightly, and the university, right? The university for her is an important bulwark, right? That we have people who are, not just finding facts, although that is important also, but narrating them in stories. I think this is what David was talking about, which is so important, right? The narration, right? Not just these documents thrown out there, but the re-narration of them in a story that we can understand and absorb. So is the question basically what do we do? I think that in this moment, it's really important to not just pay attention to, people blowing the whistle about government, but to see broad truth telling happening around us. So, the important protests that you mentioned around in Minnesota and elsewhere about George Floyd, about Black Lives Matter, as seeing those kind of protests as themselves forms of truth telling, right? And is connected to, the gig workers who were on strike way back when, about having to do their jobs without the appropriate personal protective equipment, seeing these forms of what I would see is more democratic truth telling, more collective truth telling, right? That's not just a lone individual, but can be this kind of collective world building act. And if we get to I don't know if we were in an ideal democracy, what truth telling would look like. But my sense is that we would always need the truth telling of the marginalized to show how their very act of truth telling is almost always, right, at least at first, seen as improper, right? That they always have to make space for the ability to tell their own reality. And that's what we should be looking for and having solidarity with right now.
Well, I'll pick up a little bit from where Lita was. So the past 4 years, the Trump administration has been even more vivid than past presidencies as a struggle over who gets to be the truth tellers out here. And why is it that President Trump has such a hard time with the New York Times and the Washington Post and, others? Because he wants, as all politicians do, his version of the truth out there, and that's why he gets so enraged when Fox News on rare occasion takes off after him, because he thinks that this is supposed to be a team in which he's got his group of partisans, and that we're out somewhere else rooting for another team. That isn't how American journalism works. I'm sure that Donald Trump thinks we have it in for him. I can tell you that Barack Obama thought we had it in for him. I can tell you that George Bush thought we had it in for him. Bill Clinton sure as hell thought we had it in for him, right? So you get a struggle over who has the credibility to go do this. And the reason that it's so important that we have big, important news organizations that have a track record of telling the truth is that they lend their imprimatur to these versions of events. And over time, the public gets to decide, are we right a whole lot more often than we're wrong? And look, we make mistakes in journalistic organizations are collections of humans, and humans screw it up, right? And the question is, how well do you then come back, correct what you've done, learn from it, move on, re-report it, and get it out there again? So where does that merge with whistleblowers? As Lita suggests, the whistleblowers by nature don't have much of a public platform. And so if a whistleblower goes and reveals something and no one pays any attention, what's the utility of what they have done? That's why WikiLeaks was important to Manning. And that's why the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian and others were important to WikiLeaks. Because when WikiLeaks alone had the material, all they did was throw it out there, and no one would have any way of assessing what it meant. So it's not simply that we're putting a narrative around it, we're putting other reporting around it that questions whether or not the lens through which the whistleblower sees the world is the only lens through which you should see the world. I get lots of whistleblowers who come to me in outrage that something has happened in the US government. And when I go report it, I find some perfectly reasonable explanations for why something happened. This is a really not rare event. It last happened to me this weekend, okay? Where somebody came to describe a program that had been killed within the US government. And it turned out that it had been killed for a pretty good reason. So that whistleblower may not have had access to or understanding of. So whistleblowers can be vitally important, as I said, about the impeachment. But that doesn't mean that you can give up the journalistic function. Fortunately, this is a golden age for journalism. I realize it doesn't seem like that when you hear about journalist organizations dying across the country, and there is a major concern there that I'll get to. But at the high end, for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the major networks, ProPublica, all those kind of groups, you have more and better resources going into investigative journalism today than you had 5 or 10 years ago. And the Trump administration has been like, a boon to investigative journalists, right? Because you can't open up a transaction without discovering a favor being done someplace or another for a friend, or something that affects the Trump businesses, or so forth. Where our problem is actually not at the national level. It's at the local level. Because the business model that supports really great journalism at the very high-end national level, that makes people around the world, 4.5 million of them, pay for subscriptions to the New York Times digitally, doesn't exist for local news organizations. And so the whistleblowers I'm worried about aren't about the ones who are inside the National Security Council. It's the ones who are inside the Milwaukee Sewer Department, to make something up, right? That, in other words, that the local corrupt sewer commissioner someplace may not be exposed in the future because the journalistic validator for that whistleblower to go to isn't there, and that news organization is missing. And thus you could have the best whistleblowers in the world inside the Cincinnati school district, and again, I'm making it up, but if the Cincinnati Enquirer isn't healthy and able to bring its own reporting to it and validate it and repeat it, then the whistleblowing effect is a lot diminished.
Bill, I'm going to jump in and actually ask you to answer 2 questions from the audience instead of just giving us your take on that broad question. Sounds good?
Yep.
So you have a question by Risa, which was posted in the chat to everyone. And Bill Miles also has a question for you. Risa, do you want to ask it yourself, or else I'll read it? And Bill said he would ask it. So Risa's question is this: the idea that whistleblowing is a practical American mechanism that emerged in response to the ills of the modern Leviathan is a provocative one. I'd love to hear more on the issue of timing. Many of the issues you raised about political inequality, opaque decision-making procedures, etc. in the US have been around for a long time. They are not particularly new problems. So why an explosion now and not before? And does your argument give us insights about where and when we might expect to see a similar spike beyond US borders? And please take Bill Miles' question also.
Yeah.
Bill Miles?
Yes, so I have a deep state question because when I was hearing, Bill, your description of US democracy as being an overburdened Leviathan, and then David's invocation of the President of the United States, then Obama, not even knowing that we were spying on the leaders of foreign allies, the notion of deep state had a different meaning to me, that there are opaque decision makers within our very complex federal bureaucracy. And so in that sense, there is a deep state that cannot be controlled for the reasons that that you described and that David gave a very excellent example of.
Yeah, those are 2 great questions. So just very briefly and concisely, so we have enough time for other people to also raise questions. One has to tell a much more fine-tuned story about the history of whistleblowing in the US than I was able to do. I mean, I think in a way, David already began providing us with that story. Daniel Ellsberg is really the first whistleblower, arguably, right? I mean, we can see some precursors. So this has something to do with the national security state, or at least the first government whistleblower, excuse me, okay? There's also Ralph Nader, who's also not insignificant, who's responding to a very different set of ills, social ills, right? He thinks corporate America is not building safe automobiles. So one would have to tell a story, I would say, about the national security state. One would have to tell a story about growing skepticism and understandable skepticism about changes taking place in the economy and how they impact consumers. But I do think that story would have some particularly American features to it, at least in terms of understanding the genesis of the practice. I mean, it's become a global story, of course, right? Whistleblowing is taking place everywhere. So one has to go into more detail to do that. Yeah, Bill Miles, your question. This language of the deep state worries me. It is an ABC of political science 101. That the modern state, there are a lot of crucial decisions being made and are not particularly transparent, right? And we have to figure this out. And a lot of the history of our polity and other polities is an attempt to come to try to do something about that, I don't think deep state is the right term here. And also just to complicate things a little bit, I mean, it's partly the federal bureaucracy, it's partly public-private forms of decision-making, which transcend the federal bureaucracy or any bureaucracy, any state bureaucracy, right? I mean, that's also what's going on. in the government. It's not a group of state bureaucrats who behind closed doors are making decisions we don't know anything about. That's too simple. So I don't think deep state catches some of the complexities here. And Candice, if I could I say something about your question very briefly? Very briefly, right? So I'm a little worried. I think this is also a kind of gatekeeping with whistleblowing. We start associating whistleblowing with truth-telling. I just think a lot of the whistleblowers are doing things they see as much more down to earth. You know, they're saying, there's something lousy happening. People should know about this stuff. You want to call that truth-telling, that's fine. But I'm not sure that may up the ante in ways that are potentially problematic or potentially unfair. And okay, we can talk about an ideal democracy. As I was suggesting, in a better democracy, there would be less whistleblowing that would be necessary. I think more practical for us is to talk about a better democracy where whistleblowing would be legalized. We'd have channels which would allow for it to happen, which would not result in the kind of terrible things that happen to so many whistleblowers. And that's a real conversation we should be having.
Thank you. We have a question from Carla Kaplan. Also, all three were from last year's cohorts.
Can you hear me okay?
Great.
First of all, thank you all so much for 3 absolutely wonderful talks. That was terrific. And given this discussion about sort of who is and isn't a whistleblower, I think I have to confess. So I need to start by saying I'm writing a biography of a major muckraker. I'm doing Jessica Mitford's biography. And I do tend to conflate whistleblowing with muckraking. So that may in some ways inflect my question. So I guess I wanted to just confess to that right off the bat. This is sort of a question for Lida, but it could be for any of the 3 of you. And I wanted to say, Lida, I really appreciated your framing of some of your remarks in terms of Lord's master's tools and that discussion, but it raised for me these really large questions about whistleblowing and race, particularly in this moment of racial reckoning. Given the depths of systemic racism, given the depths of our national dishonesty about race, is there any sense in which whistleblowing itself needs to be understood, whether or not it's addressing racial issues, as racialized in some systemic way? Is there a way in which we need to racialize our own understanding of the phenomenon of whistleblowing? So that's my question for Lida or any of you, and I'll remute myself.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. I mean, this will be a gesture more than an answer. I mean, I think the answer is like, yes. I mean, we do. I mean, who feels authorized to claim themselves as a whistleblower, that they will be received, right, as legitimate? I mean, I can't actually think. The other people here have more knowledge actually of this than I do. So maybe they can think of like a prominent, like public whistleblower who is a person of color. It's hard for me to think of it at this moment. And it may seem like a mode of truth-telling that is not available, right, to them, to be seen on their own, right? The whistleblower is such an individualized category, right? To be seen on their own as having legitimacy and authority to take this action. And I think that part of what you're raising in terms of the deep racism, right, that undergirds this country and our silence about it is like, yes, we need truth to have democracy, but what is the truth that we need to be paying attention to? And like the truth that you're saying is like not just a set of facts, right, but it's the systemic and the systemic nature of racism and our longstanding silence about it. So I'll just be brief and say that. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, Lida. So we have unfortunately run out of time, even got a little bit over. So I think I speak for everyone in the audience here in saying this was really a wonderful discussion. We are very grateful you could all join us tonight. And Lori is going to say the final word.
I just want to thank you, Candice, for your thoughtful questions and everybody for thoughtful, interesting, provocative remarks at a critical juncture. This conversation, I'm sure, will be ongoing. I apologize to those of you whose questions we never got to in the chat, but I think is a symptom of how rich this topic is. and I look forward to continued learning. Thank you all for your time and the serious attention that you're giving to such important concerns. Thanks, everyone.